The air inside the tent is stagnant, undisturbed by the desert heat pressing against the canvas. A man stands motionless, holding a curved blade edge up. He drops a veil of fine silk. Gravity pulls the fabric down, a few grams of weight drifting through the dry air. There is no sound of tearing. The silk does not crumple or snay. It meets the steel and separates, the two halves floating to the floor as if the structural integrity of the weave simply ceased to exist. This is not magic. It is tribal organ physics operating at a scale the human eye cannot perceive. The edge of the blade is not a smooth line. Under high magnification, it reveals itself as a series of microscopic saw teeth, hard carbide crystals embedded in a softer steel matrix. When the silk contacts these microserrations, the pressure applied by the fabric's negligible mass is concentrated onto the microscopic teeth of nanoears, exceeding the tensile strength of the fiber and severing it. This is the murderous grace of the Damascus sword, a weapon that conquered the medieval world not through sorcery, but through an accidental mastery of nanotechnology for centuries before the microscope was invented. The steel that made this violence possible was born thousands of miles away from the Syrian city that gave it its name. It began in the iron-rich soils of the Indian subcontinent, in the heat of the Deccan Plateau, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. Here, in the mid-first millennium BC, metallurgisters developed a process that would baffle Western science for 2,000 years. They called it yokaiku in Canada, or yurekshu in Tamil, words denoting the act of melting of fluid metal oozing from the earth. To the ears of British colonialists centuries later, the word would mutate into Wootz, a term that became synonymous with the metallurgical anomaly of steel that was both incredibly hardened, remarkably tough. A paradox in a world where hard metals shattered and tough metals bent. The production of this material was a feat of survival engineering, a precise orchestration of heat and chemistry carried out in small clay crucibles, no larger than a coffee mug. The recipe was specific and unforgiving. The smelters packed the crucibles with bloomery iron, wood chips, and leaves. But not just any organic matter. They used the leaves of cassia or Reculetida, known locally as aviaram, and wood from Dalberia. These were not random choices. Modern botanical analysis reveals that cassia or Reculetida acts as a hyperaccumulator of transition metals, pulling zinc, nickel, and copper from the soil. The ancient smiths were not just adding carbon, they were introducing a specific cocktail of trace elements into the melt, an exercise in phytochemistries that turned a simple iron reduction into a complex alloy synthesis. The crucible was sealed with a clay lid, creating a closed system. It was buried in a charcoal furnace and brought to a temperature between 1300 and 1400 degrees Celsius. Inside this dark, superheated vessel, the iron liquefied. This was a critical divergence from European metallurgy, which relied on solid-state carburization. In India, the steel became molten. The carbon from the aviarum leaves and charcoal diffused into the liquid iron, driving the carbon content up to 1.5 or even to 0.0% levels that would render European steel uselessly brittle, akin to cast iron. The molten state allowed the slag impurities of silica and minerals to float to the surface, forming a glass seal that protected the metal from oxidation. But the true secret lay in the cooling. The furnace was not open. The fire was allowed to die, and the crucible remained buried in the ash, cooling at a painfully slow rate, perhaps as little as 1 degree Celsius per minute. It was in this slow descent through the temperature gradient that the physics of the Damascus pattern was written. As the liquid solidified, it formed a dendritic structure, a reel-like crystallization of iron. The trace elements, specifically vanadium and molybdenum derived from the local ores and plant additives, were rejected by the solidifying iron dendrite. They were pushed into the spaces between the crystal branches, the interred dendritic regions. These impurities were not defects, they were the architects of the steel structure. The vanadium acted as a pinning agent. It formed hard carbides that anchored the cemented iron carbide, forcing it to cluster in specific bands rather than growing randomly. When the ingot, a puck-sized cake of steel known as a Wootz cake, was finally removed from the crucible, it looked unremarkable. But inside, the segregation of elements had laid the blueprint for the legendary watered pattern. The steel was a composite material at the microscopic level, hard, brittle cement, plates suspended in a softer, ductile perlite matrix. This material then moved north. It traveled on bullock carts to the ports of the Coromandel Coast and the Malabar Coast, to trade hubs like Aris and Maki-Lip-Atno. From there, it was loaded onto dhows, riding the monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf, eventually finding its way up the Tigris and Euphrates to the armories of Persia and Syria. It was a global supply chain of lethal intent, operating centuries before the concept of globalization existed. The Arab traders called the metal fulad, the Persians puladi. They recognized its value immediately. In the 12th century, the Arab traveler Edrisi noted that the Hindus excel in the manufacture of iron, and it is impossible to find anything to surpass the edge from Indian steel. The transformation of the raw Wootz cake into a Damascus blade required a forging technique as sophisticated as the smelting. The ingot was high in phosphorus, an impurity that makes steel hot short, prone to crumbling if struck while white hot. A European blacksmith, accustomed to working low-carbon iron at blazing temperatures, would shatter a Wootz ingot with a single blow. The Eastern smiths understood the material's temper. They forged at lower temperatures, a blood-red heat between 650 and 850 degrees Celsius. At this specific thermal window, the ultra-high carbon steel exhibited superplasticity, a state where the metal could be stretched and deformed to incredible lengths without fracturing. As the smith hammered the bar, drawing it out into the curve of a scimitar or a talwar, the internal structure of the steel shifted. The bands of cemented pinned by the vanadium impurities, were stretched and folded. The smith cut grooves into the blade, a technique known as Muhammad's ladder, or drilled shallow holes to create the rose pattern. When the blade was filed flat and etched with acid, these manipulations revealed themselves. The acid ate away the soft ferrite matrix, leaving the hard cemented bands standing in relief. The surface shimmered with the chatoyance of silk, a visual map of the steel's internal agony and alignment. This was the weapon that met the Crusaders. The encounter was a collision of metallurgical eras. The European broadsword was a bar of iron, heavy in blood, designed to crush armor through mass and momentum. The Damascus saber was a slicing tool, a composite material engineered for separation. In the fictionalized but illustrative account of the meeting between King Richard and Saladin, the difference is made physical. Richard severs an iron bar with a brute chop, demonstrating the raw power of his weapon. Saladin, in response, slices a cushion and then a floating veil, demonstrating an edge geometry and material consistency that seemed supernatural to the Western observers. The European mind could not comprehend a metal that was harder than their own yet did not shatter upon impact. They attributed it to sorcery, to quenching in dragon's blood or the urine of a red-headed boy. The reality was far more disturbing. They were being killed by superior science. In 2006, the true extent of this science was revealed. Researchers at the Technical University of Dresden dissolved a 17th-century Damascus saber in hydrochloric acid. They expected the steel to vanish. Instead, they found residue. When examined under a high-resolution transmission electron microscope, the residue revealed itself as multi-walled carbon nanotubes. Cylinders of carbon hexagonal lattices rolled into tubes with diameters as small as 10 nanometers were present in the steel. Encapsulated within these nanotubes were nanowires of cemented The ancient smiths, through their empirical optimization of the smelting and forging process, had created a metal matrix compository enforced with nanotubes. The interaction of the specific plant materials, the thermal cycling, and the catalytic properties of the trace transition metals had facilitated the growth of these nanostructures. The nanotubes acted as a sheath, protecting the brittle cemented E-wires from fracturing, allowing the blade to retain its razor edge, even after cleaving through bone and iron. The Damascus sword was not just steel, it was a nanocompositous material, a precursor to the advanced materials used in modern aerospace and ballistics. The production of these blades was an industrial enterprise of significant scale. By the late 1600s, tens of thousands of Wootz ingots were being shipped annually from the Coromandel coast to Persia. The Dutch East India Company traded in them, moving the material from the furnaces of Golconda to the workshops of Isfahan. But this industry was fragile. It relied on a specific geological lottery. The unique properties of Wootz, the banding, the nanotubes, the toughness were dependent on the trace elements found in specific ore bodies in southern India. The smiths did not know they were adding vanadium or molybdenum. They only knew that ore from a certain hill produced the watered pattern, while ore from the next hill did not. As the centuries turned, the quality began to fade. The specific veins of ore were mined out. The balance of impurities shifted. Without the vanadium to pin the carbide bands, the pattern dissolved into a muddy gray. Without the specific ratio of phosphorus and sulfur, the ingots became unworkable or brittle. The knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice through the rhythm of the hammer and the color of the flame. When the raw material changed, the technique no longer worked. The magic left the steel. The British colonial administration accelerated this extinction. Following the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, the British feared the lethal capability of the Indian populace. They initiated a systematic disarmament. Thousands of swords were seized. But the British encountered a problem. The Wootz blades were so tough, they destroyed the shearing machines designed to cut them. The blades had to be carefully inserted to protect the machines that were destroying them. The armories were dismantled, the swords broken, and the tradition severed. By the mid-19th century, the secret of Damascus steel was considered lost to history. For nearly 200 years, European metal adjusters tried to replicate the material. They failed because they approached the problem with the arrogance of industrial purity. They believed steel was simply iron and carbon. They removed the impurities, the phosphorus, the sulfur, the complex slag, believing they were refining the metal. In doing so, they stripped out the very agents that made the structure possible. Scientists like Michael Faraday, the father of electricity, spent years analyzing Wootz ingots, detecting the silicon and lumen, but missing the crucial role of the carbide-forming element. Jean-Robert Briand in Paris conducted over 300 experiments, adding platinum, gold, and even uranium to steel in a desperate attempt to reproduce the Damascus pattern. He came close understanding the role of high carbon, but the precise mechanism of the carbide banding eluded him. It was not until the late 20th century that the code was broken. Researchers John Verhoeven and Alfred Pendray, a metallurgist and a blacksmith, revisited the problem. They discovered that the secret was in the trace amounts of vanadium levels as low as 0.003%. When they added these impurities back into the melt and subjected the steel to the specific thermal cycles of the ancient smiths, the pattern returned. The bands of cement aligned. The water flowed across the blade once more. The mystery of Damascus steel is a testament to the sophistication of the ancient world. It challenges the linear narrative of technological progress. The smiths of Golconda and Damascus were not stumbling in the dark. They were operating a chemical process of extreme complexity, manipulating matter at the atomic level. They built wind-powered furnaces in Sri Lanka that utilized the monsoon gales to drive temperatures high enough to liquefy iron, a feat of aerodynamic engineering. They understood the material reality of their world with a depth that we are only now beginning to quantify. Today, The Damascus steel found in high-end kitchen knives and custom blades is largely a cosmetic imitation pattern welded steel, created by folding layers of different alloys together to create a visual contrast. It is beautiful, but it is not Wootz. It lacks the internal dendritic architecture, the carbide banding, the nanostructural reinforcement. It is a surface-level mimicry of a lost deep technology. The legacy of the Wootz blade lies not in the romantic legends of silks, scarves, and kings, but in the cold, hard data of its composition. It is a material that bridged the gap between the Iron Age and the Nanotech Age. It stands as a reminder that knowledge is not permanent. It can be lost when the supply chains break, when the resources are depleted, and when the continuity of craft is interrupted by the violence of conquest. The unknown Asia was not a place of mystery, but a place of forgotten science, where the fire of the crucible forged a technology that history is only just beginning to remember. The desert wind still blows over the ruins of Mervend, the depleted mines of the Deccan. The furnaces are cold, but in the laboratories of Dresde in Iowa, the ghosts of the ancient smiths have finally been heard. The steel they made was not magic. It was the absolute limit of what iron and carbon can do when forced together by human hands. In the mountains of Sri Lanka, the wind still howls through the passes where the furnaces once stood. Excavations at Samanalawa EWA have uncovered the remains of these engines of production. They were not simple pits. They were aerodynamic structures, built into the hillsides to capture the monsoon winds. The front walls were constructed to act as air intakes, compressing the wind and forcing it into the charcoal heart of the furnace. The pressure generated was sufficient to sustain temperatures of 1500 degrees Celsius without the need for mechanical bellows. This was industrial-scale production powered by the weather itself. The slag from these furnaces tells the story of a high-yield process, producing high-carbon steel that would eventually find its way into the crucibles of the Wootz makers. This interconnected web of technology, wind power in Sri Lanka, ore mining in the Deccan, crucible manufacturing in Tamil Nadu, and forging in Persia, created a material system that dominated the medieval world. It was a system that relied on the precise alignment of geography, botany, and geology. When we look at a museum piece today, a sword with the watered pattern shimmering under the lights, we are looking at the fossilized remains of that system. The physical toll of this production was immense. The heat of the crucible furnaces, running for 24 hours, required constant attention. The breaking of the crucibles to retrieve the ingots was heavy labor. The forging of the high-carbon steel, performed at relatively low temperatures to preserve the carbide structure, required thousands of hammer blows. The vibration of the impact would travel up the smith's arm, calcifying the joints and thickening the bone. The air in the workshops would be thick with the stench of sweat and the metallic tang of scale. It was a brutal, physical interface with the material world. Yet, from this brutality came an objective supreme refinement. The Damascus blade was a paradox, a synthesis of destruction and creation. It was a tool designed to sever human flesh with maximum efficiency, yet it was crafted with an aesthetic sensitivity that turned the weapon into a piece of art. The Mohammed's ladder pattern was not just decoration, it was a manipulation of the steel's grain to ensure uniform distribution of the carbides, enhancing the blade's structural integrity. The form followed the function, and the beauty was a byproduct of the engineering. We are left with the realization that the Dark Ages were illuminated by the glow of these furnaces. The unknown Asia was a reservoir of technical competence that eclipsed the capabilities of the West for centuries. The carbon nanotubes in the blade of a 17th century saber are a silent rebuke to the assumption of modern superiority. They exist as a physical fact, a hard reality that demands we rewrite the history of technology. The sharpest edge in history was not honed by a laser or a diamond cutter, but by a blacksmith in a mud brick workshop, guided by the color of the hot steel and the legacy of 1,000 years of experimentation. The silk falls, the steel waits, and the cut is made a separation of matter that echoes across the centuries.